I was fortunate enough to be invited to a preview event where I was able to play 3 hours of Shadow of the Erdtree. I've already made a video detailing my gameplay experience, where I discuss the bosses I fought, the mechanics I encountered, and the weapons I used. However, that was not all I got to see during those 3 hours. I was also able to read a lot of item descriptions, speak to some significant lore NPCs, but I largely left out these deeper lore interactions from my last video to keep that video lore light. However, I know there are those who would love to hear the lore that I uncovered in those 3 hours, as there was some really interesting lore bits that can serve as an introduction to the DLC's greater story and themes. A few disclaimers before we begin this video. First is that I had 3 hours with the game only, and I had to balance playing and experiencing the game with writing notes. And so basically I was hastily scribbling notes on my iPhone as I came across something lore significant. With that in mind, I don't have many direct quotes and will mainly be paraphrasing both NPC dialogues and item descriptions. However, my paraphrasing will get over the general gist of the lore that was contained within these item descriptions and lore dialogues. However, thanks to Vati's preview video, we do have an excellent resource, as Vati was able to transcribe precisely some item descriptions and NPC dialogues, which I was able to use to compare against my own notes and use them where necessary. So massive shout out to Vati for providing this excellent resource. Aside from Vati, I will be drawing on information provided by some other attendees, so I can combine it with my own information to get a more complete picture, as we all saw different things. The second disclaimer is an obvious one. This is not the complete or final lore of Shadow of the Erdtree. It is the absolute surface level analysis based on a fraction of the item descriptions that will be in the DLC. So a lot of my conclusions will be speculative, and we will only know the truth of the lore when the game fully releases. This video is just meant as a lore appetizer, an introduction to whet your appetite for what is to come, and I am absolutely not married to the speculations and conclusions I draw in this video. With all that out of the way, remember that if you like Elden Ring lore and what I do here on the channel, then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, as it helps me out immensely. And before we begin, I am compelled to give you one final spoiler warning. There are going to be major spoilers in this video for the first 3 hours of Shadow of the Erdtree. So please turn off this video now if you think that is something that will bother you. But before we unveil the secrets of the lands of Shadow, it is time for a word from today's sponsor, Factor. I don't know about you, but sometimes I just cannot face the kitchen after a busy day. But thankfully, Factor's meals eliminate the hassle of prepping, cooking, and cleaning up, as every meal is ready to go. Many Tarnished are going to be busy over the coming weeks, and Factor meals are ideal, as every meal arrives ready to eat in just 2 minutes. And with a weekly menu of 35 meals per week, catering to every need and diet, with Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, or vegan and veggie meal options. Factor isn't just resting on its laurels, however, as they are continuing to offer new options like breakfast, smoothies, juices, small bites, and more, keeping you away from the takeout trap with healthier and cheaper meals that are ready far quicker. So if you are interested in eating healthier while you explore the lands of Shadow, then Factor has a great deal for SmoughTown viewers. Get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders using my link. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. Thanks again to Factor for fueling the lore, and now back to the lands of Shadow. It's probably fitting that we talk about the Shadow of the Erdtree and the Erdtree. We now know that the Shadow of the Erdtree is named the Skadu Tree, and its fragments, the fragments of the Skadu Tree, are what we use to apply the new blessings that power us up in the DLC, the new Shadow Realm Blessings mechanic. I initially found the name Skadu Tree quite strange. However, after doing a bit of googling, I was able to find out that it's an Old English word for shade or shadow, so yeah, it's pretty aptly named. And to start off this segment on the Skadu Tree and the Lands of Shadow, I do want to briefly talk about Marika's role in creating the Shadow Tree, as we know she was intimately involved with it thanks to the story trailer. The story trailer tells us that Marika was somehow directly involved with the beginning of the Erdtree, and that when Gold was born, so was Shadow. The Erdtree and the Scadutree, the mirror to the Erdtree, were born at the same time. All well and good. However, I found a very interesting item on my travels during this 3-hour preview event. There was an incantation called Minor Erdtree, and it said it was an incantation that allowed you to call a phantom Erdtree that would heal an area around it. So this is basically the incantation that Melina uses in the fight against Morgott should you summon her for this fight. The description had some interesting bits of lore. Again, I didn't transcribe this word for word, but I took notes paraphrasing the main points. It was described as a secret incantation of Queen Marika's, and talked about an event where Marika bathed the village of her homeland in gold, and that this incantation is a remnant of the kindness of Gold without order. So what does this all mean? Well, we know that the Numen come from outside the lands between. Does this mean that Marika has always had the power to conjure gold, and that it was the Numen homeworld that she bathed in gold? Or is this a reference to when she first created the Erdtree and covered the lands between in its golden hue? If so, why would this need to be a secret incantation of hers? This is definitely trying to tell us something about Marika's earlier life and how she created the Erdtree with the power of gold, but I don't have all the pieces yet. Additionally, it also talks of the kindness of Gold without order. To me, this is very interesting. It's obviously a reference to the healing properties one can find in relation to Gold and the ancient Erdtree era. In the Age of Plenty, the Erdtree would drop its sap, which had healing properties, and incantations dating back to this ancient Erdtree era are all about healing and abundance. To me, this is the kindness that can be found within Gold. However, as the era of the Erdtree would advance, it would fall under the sway of Radagon and the fundamentalists of the Golden Order, which really is more about order and conformity. Perhaps it's a commentary on the evolution of Marika's order and the things that she and her people lost after the heady days of the Age of Plenty. It was certainly a very interesting item description, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. With all that said, let us discuss the Scadutree once more. I found an item called the Shadow Realm Rune, which is basically a renamed version of the golden runes that you can find in the lands between. Paraphrasing, the item description said something along the lines of the Scadutree is the shadow of the Erdtree, just in case you wanted confirmation that the Scadutree and the shadow of the Erdtree are one and the same. But it reinforces this connection between Gold and Shadow, and it said something else along the lines of, no wonder Gold shines so brilliantly, because there is darkness as well. They are intimately connected to one another, and again it makes me think of that line in the story trailer, where Shadow was born at the same time as Gold. There cannot be one without the other. Interestingly, it seems to have other attributes that are in line with the Erdtree, reinforcing the fact that it is the shadow to the Erdtree and directly connected to it. For example, I found an item in the game called Knot Resin, which basically had the same appearance as the root resin for the base game. The knot of course being a reference to the knotted shape of the Scadutree. The Scadutree, while being the centre of the lands of Shadow, this domain of the taboo, still seems to be venerated by those of the Erdtree. Vati transcribed the item description for the Scadutree fragment, which reads the following: the people of the Erdtree collect these splinters and use them in prayer. The Scadutree is also the emblem that Messmer's base soldiers wear upon their chests. The reason I know this is because I was able to get one of the chest pieces for the Messmer soldiers to drop, and this is what it told me, that the insignia on their chest piece is of the Scadutree. And given how zealous Messmer and his men are in their belief of grace, which we will talk about later, I'm sure they wouldn't wear the Scadutree upon their chest unless it was a respected part of the pantheon. I came across a new aspects of the Crucible incantation, the Miranda Flower version. Again, paraphrasing the item description of this incantation, it said that the power of the Crucible was powerful in these lands before they were covered in shadow. Throughout my trailer analysis videos, I have suggested that the civilization that once stood in the lands of shadow was that of the Crucible people, and all signs do seem to be pointing that way, and that it was by Marika's actions that this era was upended and the age of the Erdtree began. The interview quote that I've really latched onto here is one from Miyazaki in a Famitsu article. When discussing the divine-based dancing lion, he said the following: "Naturally, there was a culture that existed before the Golden Tree, and the lion dance character is derived from that culture. So I hope you feel the scent of a different culture, which is a little different from the main story." But with that said, there is more to these lands than it simply being a prior civilization that was torn down. The story trailer tells us that when gold was born, so was shadow. Whatever this land was before, it has been completely upended and made into the Shadow Realm, the reflection of the lands between. In my first gameplay trailer analysis video, I posited that these lands had effectively been repurposed into a sort of underworld, where all things taboo would find themselves: death, the omen, and spirits. With this in mind, another attendee at my event, Emma, who was writing for Eurogamer, discovered something of particular interest. Quoting directly from Emma's article, which will be linked below: "In the early stages of my journey through the Land of Shadow, I came across a tower called the Pillar of Suppression, at the top of which read, 'The very centre of the lands between. All manners of death wash up here, only to be suppressed.' So while we will be walking in the shattered remains of what I think was an Omen or Crucible civilization, it has been tied and changed by the new cosmic system that came into being with the creation of the Erdtree and SmoughTown, and now it seemingly serves as the dumping grounds for everything antithetical to the Golden Order, watched over by Messmer." According to the quote that Emma transcribed, this is the centre of this universe, or the lands between somehow, and things that are brought here and suppressed. It is the dumping ground for things that don't belong now in the world of grace. Given the Rune of Death was expunged from the Elden Ring upon the creation of the Golden Order, it should be no surprise that death may find its way here to the lands of shadow, as death now no longer has any place in the lands between. With this in mind, the name and aesthetic of the first area might begin to make more sense: the Gravesite Plains, where spectral graves dot the landscape. Though, in fairness, these spirit graves are just as likely to be vestiges of Messmer's brutal war, but nonetheless I think it's significant that death is at the forefront of the first area and its aesthetic. And that isn't the only reference to death that some people got in their preview. In Vati's preview video, he relayed a boss encounter that another attendee at his event came across: Godwyn's Loyal Knight. Vati says that he was told that the drop from this boss was called the Death Knight Twin Axes, suggesting that Godwyn actually has an order of Death Knights, and they are still operating in these lands. There was also something interesting regarding the Death Birds of the Death Rites. There was a new enemy called the Grave Birds, and these are the stone birds that you could find at the top of Bellerat Tower Settlement. We had a spirit ash for these birds, and it contained some interesting lore, telling us that these constructs were created to be companions to the Death Birds. In prior videos, we have discussed the Death Birds in detail, but in short, they oversaw death rites in the time before the Erdtree. Again, the presence here of these grave birds that are tied to the death rites implies that this was a land that was the centre of power and culture before the Erdtree's rise, and that the death rites were in full swing before Erdtree burial became the dominant death rite. I hope we learn more about these constructs and the death rites in general, and for those who are hoping about more lore about death and Godwyn, you are likely in luck. But the Omen were the most prominent faction that I encountered in Gravesite Plains. This should be no surprise to those who have been paying attention to the marketing material, as it seems as though there will be lots of Crucible incantations and enemies. When I was wandering the fields of Gravesite Plains, I came across these Omen enemies who are holding candles. the ones that you can see here in the gameplay trailer. We are also getting insight into a new culture, the Hornsent, and they seem to be centered around the Tower Settlement, Belurat, which was the first legacy dungeon that I experienced during the preview. To me, these Hornsent are clearly Omen, but they just had a different name. Within Belurat Tower Settlement, I came across these huge enemies. They were called Omen soldiers. And I know they were directly referenced as Omen because I got one of their armor sets to drop. And for me, the Omen and the Hornsent are clearly one, it's just that there's a different name, and we'll talk about that shortly. But I found some interesting items that I had written down as Hornsent currency, but thanks to Vati we know the exact names of them. Silver Horn Tender and Golden Horn Tender. And in the item description, it tells us that these are currency that was once used by the Hornsent. Additionally, the NPC that you can see in the B-roll footage here, one of Miquella's companions, is a native of these lands, and he is also referred to as a Hornsent. And as you can see by looking close up at him, he does have Omen horns covering his face and popping out of his head. At the end of the day, the Omen is a very negative term to label people who are touched by the Crucible. Does it therefore not make sense that in a time before the Erdtree, where anything that was touched by the Crucible was actually considered divine, that they wouldn't actually be called Omen? They wouldn't have this negative label. They would have another name, perhaps the Hornsent. Either way, it seems as though there was a very strong culture here. They had their own city, their own currency, and of course their own cultural practices, which I alluded to earlier in the Divine Beast Lion Dancer. And so it's very much thematically in line with this Hornsent settlement that the boss of this area is this Divine Beast Lion Dancer. This is an Omen operated costume. I've discussed this in both of my trailer analysis videos before, but we can clearly see from the feet of the people underneath this Lion Dancer that it's operated by Omen, and this is also indicated by the Omen horns that are coming out of the top of this beast. The remembrance of the Lion Dancer was interesting as well, telling us that it's a cultural remnant of the Tower Settlement that would be presented during a particular festival. But when Messmer the Impaler invaded this land, it was turned into a weapon of war, as we saw in the story trailer. Now, someone made an interesting suggestion to me, a viewer called Fae Queen Corey, suggesting that the Divine Beast could be a representation of Sarosh. And this is really interesting to me because I've long suggested in some of my older lore videos that Sarosh, beasts, hawks are all indicators and remnants of the Crucible era and the time before the Erdtree's ascendancy. The Beastclaw Greathammer names Sarosh Lord of Beasts, and so if Sarosh was a lord before he was defeated by Godfrey, then it might not be surprising that the Lord of Beasts is being venerated here in this ancient cultural practice. When I discuss these ideas in my Godfrey video, for example, I look at Stormveil Castle as a sort of time capsule of the time before the Erdtree. It is a place where storms rage like no other, and it's where the Stormhawks and the Stormhawk King used to rule. As such, even now, the hawk imagery is preserved, and is blended with the Sarosh livery of Godfrey and his golden lineage. The banished knights which are present at Stormveil and whose weapons can be found at Round Table Hold also bear the power of storms. Both Round Table Hold and Stormveil are associated with Godfrey, and so I've speculated that these banished knights were warriors of a past age, warriors of the Stormlord, who were incorporated into Godfrey's military after he defeated their lord. Given Godfrey himself and his Crucible Knights are men of the Crucible era, I speculate that storms, beasts and hawks are also constituent parts of the Crucible era alongside the Omen, the era of beasts. Thus I find it fascinating that the Divine Beast Dancing Lion also summons the power of storms in its fight with us. It cycled between lightning, ice and storm elemental attacks. And as I discussed in my gameplay preview video, the Divine Beast Lion Dancer's remembrance can be traded to Inea for a talisman that boosts the potency of storm attacks. Thus I really feel like this has all been tied together. The themes of the Crucible era seem to be coalescing into one society here at Belurat, the Divine Beast, the Storms, and the Omen. Another bit of lore about the Divine Beast Lion Dancer is that it actually seems to be dead or inactive when you first enter its arena, and it's brought back to life or made active by the prayer of an old woman that you hear in the boss cinematic. And this dialogue is really interesting, and again I wrote down it paraphrasing in my notes, but again Vati provided the full transcription of this dialogue. It's clear that there's a lot of resentment here for those connected to Marika and the Erdtree, as the old woman calls upon the dancer to destroy the Strumpet's vile progeny, the Strumpet no doubt being Marika, and we, the vile progeny. Another thing of interest here in this opening prayer, and it was something I didn't notice until Vati mentioned it in his video, is that the old woman seems to be calling on a divine force to possess the dancing lion, a horn-decked beast from high, so a new deity worshipped by this community, a horned god for the horn-sent Omen. And to me this just further enriches the lore for these horn-sent people, the society that Marika betrayed and Messmer then burned. They had their own currency, military, rituals, culture, and now gods. And again, shout out to Vati for highlighting this call to a divine horn beast from high. I didn't encounter this, but Vati also said you could actually find this old woman in a storeroom nearby the boss encounter, and that she was called Empyrean Grandam. Additionally, Vati said that she wouldn't talk to you, but someone else at his event, the journalist Jeremy Ray, discovered that if you put on the Divine Beast head, which was a headpiece that would drop from this boss fight, she would talk to you. The fact that there's an Empyrean associated with this faction is truly fascinating. And already you can see why these people resent Marika and her people so much. Even we as Tarnished, who were once an underclass of Erdtree society, are hated because of our connection to Marika and her people.
Another, treading the heels of Miquella. Then, as that woman would surely say, we are in our purposes well aligned. But understand, your kind are not forgiven. The Erdtree is my people's enemy. By Marika long betrayed, set aflame. I believe Miquella's apologies when he says our delivery will come, but never will I see your kind as worthy.
And now we learn that they had an Empyrean of their own. Here was an Empyrean homegrown, who could possibly succeed. But then this chance was stolen by Marika and her people, and eventually the Horn-Sent were slaughtered by her son, Messmer. I think so far of the lore, this is the bit that interests me the most. This old culture. Those Horn-Sent who built Belurat Tower Settlement, who had lion dancers and festivals, in a time before the Erdtree even existed. In our current era, in our timeline of Elden Ring, everything is so dominated by the Erdtree, it's hard to imagine a culture that evolved without it, and yet here we have one. And they resent us. They resent us, they resent Marika, and they resent the Erdtree. The Erdtree stole everything from them, and then Marika's son, Messmer, burned anything they had left to the ground in a brutal crusade. With that said, this is probably a good segue to talk about what I learned about Messmer and his crusade. So I did uncover multiple interesting item descriptions regarding Messmer's war. There are multiple items that referred to it as a crusade specifically, such as Messmer's Grease and in the Crusader's insignia. And thanks to Vati's video, we now have some transcribed item descriptions that reinforce the idea that this was a crusade. One such item is the Shield of Messmer's Black Knights, which reads the following: weighty shields carried by the Black Knights, servants of Messmer, symbolic of their iron conviction in their crusade. The Black Knights will never yield, nor will they ever doubt their purpose. In that first gameplay trailer, Messmer does have some dialogue where he expresses surprise at Marika sanctioning our lordship, because we are beings bereft of light, we are graceless tarnished. But this dialogue of Messmer's hints at his beliefs. He does not like things that do not have grace, those bereft of light, like the tarnished, and indeed this is reinforced by another dialogue I experienced in-game, and this was the NPC that invaded me in Belurat. Fire Knight Quillen, who declared that all of those without grace would die in Messmer's flame. He was mocking about it as well. When I killed him, he dropped the Crusader's insignia, which again referred to Messmer's war as a sacred crusade. This is seen by Messmer and his followers as a holy purpose, to expunge these lands of those who are not connected to grace and the Erdtree. Before we go any further, I want to clarify the different ranks that are in Messmer's forces. There are the Messmer soldiers, which are kin to the basic soldiery of the demigods. These are the ones you can see in the B-roll here, armed with axes, and the ones walking rank and file in the story trailer, with black capes and face masks. Then there are the Black Knights, which are akin to the knights found in other demigods' armies, armoured head to toe in black armour, great shields, and wielding great hammers. And again, you can see one clearly in this image here. And then finally we have these Fire Knights, to which Quillen belongs to. And my assumption is that these are another order, completely separate from the regular army, and guessing from Quillen's behaviour and dialogue, they are the most zealous, who hunt down Messmer's graceless enemies. Messmer is a radical who has fundamentalist views about grace and those without it, and so despite his dark appearance, he is loyal to grace. Messmer and his crusaders are zealous warriors committed to grace, and thus they are here to crusade against those who are not connected to grace. But as I speculated in my story trailer analysis, it seems as though that the subdued colours and attire of both the knights and the rank and file soldiers is a purposeful choice. It is meant to represent the solemn duty that they are undertaking. As the story trailer says, this was a war without grace or honour, and thus they are dressed the part, in black. This idea is also reflected in the Black Knight's shield item description that we just read. They were not to doubt their purpose. All of this points to an army that was meant to be solemn and stoic in the face of their distasteful yet necessary slaughter that they were undertaking, becoming detached from the reality of their actions. As I mentioned earlier, I did get the Messmer soldier to drop their armour, the baseline soldier that is, and it explained that what they bear on their chest is actually the Skadu tree, and that this insignia is the only piece of their armour that's in gold, and that this small piece of gold is meant to offer them some solace in the face of the war that they were meant to prosecute, a war without honour or grace. The darkness does not end there, however, as I was also lucky enough to have one of these soldiers drop their axe, and its description read, "A favourite of those who lost themselves utterly in their lord's war." This was a brutal war like no other, with some of those perpetrating it losing themselves to the violence. The most interesting lore regarding Messmer in my short playtime came via the ashes of Black Knight Captain Andreas. It told us that he was once a commander of the Black Knights, and that he was loyal to Messmer even after he fled the Erdtree, but that when Andreas learned of his lord's serpentine nature, he rebelled against him, and thus was sealed within a tomb, meaning he is now a spirit dash that we can summon. So lots of fascinating details here for us to unpack in a couple of sentences. Firstly, Andreas stayed loyal to Messmer even after Messmer fled from the Erdtree. So what are we to make of this? It's clear that Messmer and his followers are grace extremists, believers in grace, so why would they flee from the Erdtree? Did he disagree with his mother on something? The dialogue of the horn-sent individual who is among Miquella's companions tells us that his people resent Marika, because it was her who betrayed them and set them aflame. This concept of betrayal is interesting, because remember the opening lines of the story DLC trailer relay the fact that Marika seduced and betrayed someone, and going by the visuals of the story trailer, it looks like after this betrayal she took the power of that person she betrayed, probably the leader of these horn-sent, and used it to create the Erdtree. But what is interesting is that this dialogue from the horn-sent individual seems to lay the blame of them being burned by Messmer at Marika's feet as well. And so this would align with what I said in my story trailer analysis video, that Messmer was undertaking this crusade, this slaughter, on Marika's commands, However, the precise wording of Andreas's ashes really makes me doubt this narrative now. Why would Messmer flee from the Erdtree if this was a sanctioned crusade? Additionally, I discovered a ghost in Castle Ensis, who had an interesting dialogue. They were praying to Queen Marika, and imploring her to reach out to her son, Messmer, so that this crusade could finally come to an end. As if there's a sort of falling out or disconnect between Marika and Messmer. And so now, I do have to agree with Vati's assessment that perhaps Messmer is undertaking this crusade for his own reasons. As I've explained numerous times now, he has extreme beliefs surrounding grace and those without it, and perhaps it was these beliefs and a difference of opinion with his mother regarding these matters that led him to come to the lands of Shadow and perpetrate this crusade. So with all this new information in mind, this is what I speculate the order of events to be. Marika aligns herself with the current god of this crucible age, after the Numen first arrive in this world. She then betrays and murders them, taking their power for herself and creating the Erdtree. At the same time that gold is created, so too is the shadow of the Erdtree, and thus these lands of shadow are displaced, becoming the dark mirror or inversion of the lands between, a pocket dimension. However, it is Messmer who undertakes this crusade of his own free will. It is not Marika's command to do this. And this is why soldiers like Andreas had to choose whether he was loyal to Messmer or the Erdtree, because this was an unsanctioned move by Messmer. As we will discuss in the last part of this video, people like Rylana of the Carian family also chose to give up their titles in order to follow Messmer, again reinforcing the idea that this was not sanctioned by the ruling body of the lands between. Of course, there's another interesting aspect to this description of Andreas's ash that we haven't talked about yet, the reference to Serpents, and that despite Andreas staying loyal to Messmer when he fled from the Erdtree and undertook this crusade against Marika's will, this loyalty was finally shaken when Andreas discovered Messmer's association to snakes. And this does make sense. While Messmer disobeyed Marika by coming here to the lands of Shadow, I'm sure people that shared in Messmer's belief about grace and those without it still will have seen themselves as the true loyalists to the Erdtree and the world of grace, despite Marika's commands. However, aligning oneself with snakes is a step too far. That is straying from grace. Because we of course know that serpents are indeed viewed as an enemy to the Erdtree. We've read the item description for the Duelist's Helm a number of times on this channel, but let's read it again now. It reads the following. Bronze helm decorated with innumerable snakes, worn by gladiators who were driven from the Colosseum. The snake is viewed as a traitor to the Erdtree, and the audience delighted in seeing these bronze effigies beaten and battered. Now, in my first gameplay trailer analysis video, I suggested that perhaps Messmer is the reason that serpents are now seen as enemies to the Erdtree. However, the description of Andreas's ash suggests that this is not the case, and that even by Messmer's time, they were already viewed as traitors to the Erdtree. And post-release of the DLC, when I am doing long-form lore videos, this is something I will need to bear in mind when I'm trying to place everything in the timeline. And again, that's something we will try and discuss at the end of this video. That's more or less all I want to say about Messmer's crusade at this point, that it was something he undertook himself, because he is zealous in his belief about grace, and that people that followed him here had to also choose between loyalty to Messmer and to the Erdtree authorities. There's one more thing I do want to talk about though, the furnace golems, as I am endlessly fascinated by them and what they could represent. Before even having any access to item descriptions that relate to them, which I didn't get access to, their visual design alone has a story to tell, and having been closer to them, there is more I want to say about them. On the front of the basket is a face, and from this face sprouts what I see to be Omen horns. And to me this represents the foe that they were meant to exterminate, the Omen. On their legs is something possibly even more interesting. To me, the faces on their legs look like those of the fire giants. We know that following the war with the fire giants, many were inspired by the awesome power that they once wielded, and so weapons were fashioned to try and replicate that power. The flame chariots, the visage shield, and the fire monks would eventually change their entire appearance to mimic that of the fire giants? Is it the case that these horrific weapons, these golems, have also been forged in imitation of the giants' destructive power? Perhaps. I think the functional purpose of them is a little easier to understand. In an interview about the DLC, Miyazaki told us that these golems have bodies within them, bodies that are burned within them. These furnace golems are just that. They are furnaces to dispose of Omen bodies. At least that's my speculation based on everything I know so far. Bear in mind how the world of gold views the Omen. They are seen as lesser, tainted. Would it therefore not make sense to have any Omen bodies burned, so that the taint of the Omen could not spread any further? This is an extermination. Messmer's flame will purify all those who lack grace. This war was so traumatic that the enemies you fight in the first area are these black spirits, the charred souls of the victims of this brutal crusade. And I can't wait to learn more about these furnace golems, but I will leave it there for now. And let us now turn to Miquella and his companions. In my gameplay preview video, I mainly skipped over Leda, the character that guides you into the Lands of Shadow. Her dialogue in Mohg's arena is mainly that you hear in the gameplay trailer. She invites you to touch the withered hand and enter the Land of Shadow. But she also says a couple of other things. She asks if you too have been brought here by the call of Miquella, and that her and her companions are already in the Lands of Shadow. So these other NPCs that you find in the Lands of Shadow are indeed part of a group that are all in service to Miquella, or all are interested in following him at the very least. They are all people that come from different backgrounds, and this is one of the things I found most interesting. For example, Freya was once a warrior of Redan, and after you summon her for the fight against the divine beast Lion Dancer, she actually has a few more things to say. You can ask her why her armor is damaged, and she'll tell you a story. She'll tell you that she was once inflicted with the Scarlet Rot following the Battle of Ionia, and that she was basically going to die and she couldn't cure it. However, Miquella drained her of the Scarlet Rot, and this is the reason that she now serves Miquella. A very fascinating piece of lore. Additionally, there's another NPC called Ansbach, and this is a character who was once a follower of Mohg. He's put his violent days behind him, and he has dedicated himself to finding out the reason why Miquella's here. So here we have someone who was once a follower of Redan, once a follower of Mohg, two other demigods, and they now have been brought together in their service to Miquella. We've of course mentioned a number of times the horn-sent individual, who is actually a native of the Lands of Shadow, who once again seems to have spoken to Miquella. Miquella seems to have promised him something, that he will make the crimes of the past right, and for this reason, he is joined with these other people that he should hate, people from the lands between, people of the Erdtree. But this is now three individuals that may well have had actual direct contact with Miquella himself. Freya claims that Miquella himself drained her of the Scarlet Rot. The Horn-sent individual talks about a promise that was made to him by Miquella, an apology that was made to him. And finally, we of course have Leda. In the story trailer, the voice that we now know to be Leda's says that Miquella spoke of the beginning, as if he told her about the beginning of the Erdtree and all these events that we see in the story trailer, again suggesting that Leda had personal contact with Miquella. And out of all of them, Leda does seem like the most aligned with Miquella. As I pointed out in my story breakdown trailer video, the armour that she wears does bear the seal of the Halig Tree upon its cape. Additionally, when I summoned her for the fight against R'hllana, she used a Miquellan Ring of Light incantation that I don't know the name of, but again this suggests that she is someone who has long been aligned with Miquella directly, being a knight that knows his incantations. To get access to the DLC in the preview event, we were given access to 3 pre-built classes, and one of them was the Knight, and they were armed with a variation of Leda's armour set that was called the Oath Keeper's set. So Leda perhaps has made an oath to Miquella that she will always serve him or come and find him. For whatever reason, I see her as the most aligned to Miquella, whereas the others have come from all walks of life. But this is a fascinating group of individuals who are here to follow the path of Miquella. And let us talk now about the Miquellan crosses, which are the main sites that show that Miquella has passed through these areas. And these crosses have been seen in both the story and gameplay trailers, so you'll know what I'm talking about. I was able to find 3 in my time with the preview, and there wasn't much mechanical to them, they more had lore points to them. And again, I believe Vati had a more in-depth transcription of what they said, but they more or less said something along the lines of, I leave part of my flesh here. So these crosses, these marks of Miquella, are actually mounds of his flesh, and at the bottom of these crosses you could see a little pile of flesh, and from this would sprout the cross. So as Miquella is passing through the lands of Shadow, he is disposing of his flesh, and leaving a message for those who would follow. This is why nearby to each of these crosses there is a special flower that you can pick up called Empyrean Blood Burgeons, the description of which tells us that they are flowers grown from the blood of the wounded Miquella. Now, whether Miquella was wounded prior to him coming to the Lands of Shadow, or during his transition between the two realms, or because he is removing his flesh remains to be seen, but it certainly raises a lot of questions. If Miquella is slowly disposing of his flesh as he travels through the Lands of Shadow, then what is the body that is left behind in Mohg's chamber? I'd always thought that when the trailer spoke of Miquella giving up his flesh, it was a reference to the body he left behind in Mohg's palace. But if he has flesh when he enters the Lands of Shadow and he's now disposing of it, then what the hell is the body that's left in Mohg's palace? Now, don't get me wrong, this could still be Miquella, and there's some separation between his physical form in both worlds because of the nature of the Lands of Shadow. But for the first time, I am beginning to wonder the truth of all this. At the very least, we certainly don't have the full picture of Miquella's fate, and the relationship between this body we find in Mohg's palace and the flesh that we find in the Lands of Shadow. Ultimately, these piles of flesh, these crosses, are left by Miquella as a sort of trail for people to follow him. And that's all well and good, and I'm sure we'll follow these right through to the end of the DLC. But the question remains, what on earth is Miquella hoping to actually achieve here? Well, once again, the dialogue from the Hornsent member of Miquella's companions is quite revealing. In this dialogue he says, "We and our purposes are well aligned. But understand, your kind are not forgiven. The Erdtree is my people's enemy, by Marika long betrayed, set aflame. I believe Miquella's apologies when he says our delivery will come, but never will I see your kind as worthy." So Miquella has promised delivery for the Hornsent in these lands, and the wording of the story trailer implied that Miquella came here because of the terrible acts of Marika and Messmer against these people. As the story trailer says, and so kindly Miquella would abandon everything, suggesting a causal link between Marika and Messmer's actions and Miquella coming here. Finally, we also have to consider the promise that Miquella made to his sister Malenia, as is alluded to in the description of her armor set. Is Miquella coming here to right the wrongs of his mother, to bring Messmer to heel and answer for his crimes? Or is he here to find a true cure for his sister's afflictions, simultaneously undoing the wrongs of the past whilst banishing the meddling influence of the outer gods? Who knows? But given what we know about Miquella, we know that he is someone who is strong of belief and conviction, a being who is willing to give up his very flesh in order to pursue his goals. And whether or not we will come into conflict with Miquella, I have no doubt that he believes he is doing what is right. As I discussed in my gameplay preview video, the second legacy dungeon of the opening area was called Castle Enzis, and it was a Carian themed dungeon. I just want to note that I will be referencing Vati's video more heavily in this section, as I was not skilled enough to beat the boss of this area, which Vati successfully did, and so he was able to transcribe her boss items, including her remembrance, armor, and other items you can get from her remembrance. So massive shout out to Vati for providing the lore of Lana and her drops, and this excellent resource he's provided in his video. Castle Enzis was defended by both Messmer soldiers and Carian Lazuli sorcerers, and Carian knights of both regular and troll variety. It represents a union between Carian and Messmer forces. This is a union of flame and moon, which is perfectly represented by the boss of this dungeon, R'hllana, the Twin Moon Knight, a Carian warrior of royal lineage who wields 2 swords with speed and skill. This R'hllana was an excellent boss, and while I got her to 1 hit, and I promise I'm not just saying that, I genuinely did, I couldn't defeat her. So again, we are relying on Vati here. And Vati transcribed the item description for her headpiece, her helmet, that you can get after defeating her, and it read the following. R'hllana, head of the royal family of Caria, was said to have given her younger sister, who renounced her lineage to chase after Messmer, a gift of lustrous black hair. So R'hllana is R'hllana's younger sister, and in fairness this is likely the conclusion that most will make from her name alone. But it seems as though she was very close to R'hllana. Like her sister, she too met a moon in her youth. Vati transcribed the description to R'hllana's twin moons, which reads the following. In her childhood, she and her elder sister R'hllana met these moons, overlapping, as though nestled against one another. So this is really fascinating because R'hllana meeting her full moon is the pivotal moment in her life that changes everything and changes the fortunes of her family. And now we know this was a moment that was shared with her sister R'hllana. However, R'hllana gave up her claim to Carian royalty in order to join Messmer. I think this loops back into what we discussed earlier, that Messmer's crusade seems to have been something unsanctioned by the Erdtree authority, and thus all who travelled with him were essentially becoming traitors, or at least would need to give up their claims in the lands between. This is reiterated by the remembrance of the Twin Moon Knight, which reads the following. Once a Carian princess, R'hllana disavowed her birthright and chose to stand at Messmer's side, knowing full well that not even the brilliance of the moon could grant him succour. Before long, she became known as the Sword of Messmer. She gave up everything for him, including her royal heritage, much like the choice faced by his knight commander Andreas as we discussed earlier. It seems as though Messmer, his cause and beliefs, seem to call very loyal and zealous warriors to his side, who are willing to give up everything. With R'hllana clearly came a lot of Carian forces who chose to follow her, including troll knights, Lazuli sorcerers, and her chamberlain Moon Irithyll. Moon Irithyll is a Carian knight that we fight midway up Castle Enzis, and is armed with her own version of the Troll Knight sword. Again, I can't remember the exact wording of this weapon's description, but it told us that she had a strong bond with the Troll Knights, and that she is chamberlain to the Twin Moon Knight R'hllana. Overall, Castle Enzis represents the alliance between R'hllana's Carian forces and Messmer's crusading army, and this alliance is no better represented than by R'hllana's weapons. Midway through her fight, she ignites both of her swords, one in the black flame of Messmer, and the other in the blue magic of the moon. It's very symbolic. Again, Vati delivered here by providing the item description of the twin swords of R'hllana, which read the following. 2 swords as a single armament. Here and here alone, were moon and fire ever together. This is quite flowery language, but it's meant to show how tight the bond between Messmer and R'hllana was, how closely moon and fire were aligned with one another, despite their opposing thematics. And with that said, I want to move on to the final part of this video where I'll try and speculate where all of this fits in the existing timeline. So I've been kind of dancing around something that has been nagging me because of a few item descriptions, and that's where do all these events sit in the existing timeline? The Horn-Sent Society, the Betrayal and Seduction, Messmer's Crusade, and Miquella's arrival. Where does this all sit on the timeline in comparison to the greater story of Elden Ring? Well, I think the first thing we need to accept and understand is that it all didn't happen in one continuous event, and these events intersect at different points with the main timeline, and I will speculate on where it all fits in relation to the rest of the timeline. So of course I think the Horn-Sent civilization flourished in the time before Marika's ascension, but it also came after Placiduous Axe's dragon civilization of ancient times. This civilization is one associated with beasts, Omen and storms, and was the time when the death rites were still the prominent funerary rites in these lands, which is why the gravebirds were constructed, and we still see their remnants in the Lands of Shadow. It's almost a time capsule. Additionally, this land, now known as the Lands of Shadow, existed physically in the Lands Between somewhere, and this was the centre of power and civilization at this time. The ruler of this civilization was likely the god or Elden Lord of this era, and in the tail end of this Crucible era, men like Godfrey would arise, violent men of a violent time, and this is why his knights would be the Crucible Knights, though in time these Crucible elements would be phased out. Marika's Erdtree era would eventually erase any of these prior influences, so it would not erode her new authority with memories of past authority. Then Marika and the Numen would arrive in these lands, and she would befriend the ruling authority, perhaps even becoming the consort to the god of this era. After some time, she would betray and murder this ruler, taking their golden power, an act of betrayal still remembered by the Hornsent to this day. And so Gold was born, and so was Shadow. In a cosmic event that we don't yet understand, the Shadow Tree was created at the same time as the Erdtree, and the Lands of Shadow were dragged into this new dimension alongside the Shadow Tree, a pocket dimension or inverted world, connected to the Erdtree and yet separated from it. This would become the place where all things antithetical to the Erdtree and Golden Order would be gathered and suppressed. The underworld, for a lack of a better term, and this would include death and things associated with the Crucible. However, I don't believe that Messmer's crusade immediately followed these events, and that for some time the Lands of Shadows were left alone. I used to think that Marika immediately commanded Messmer to destroy these lands in order to secure her power base. However, the item description of Knight Commander Andreas has led me to question this, and it heavily suggests that Messmer came here without the direct consent of Marika. This crusade was not on her orders, though many of the Hornsent, including Miquella's companion, probably still attribute Marika as being the one who ordered this. They don't know the backroom politics of the Erdtree society. All they know is that here is a son of Marika with a massive army that is burning their lands to the ground. And so I believe this crusade happened later at Messmer's instigation, but when and what precipitated it? Well, there are certainly a couple of things to note here about dating. First of all, the fire giant faces that are present on the giant furnace golems, and to me this suggests that this crusade under Messmer took place long after the war with the fire giants, and so that would suggest that the Erdtree was created alongside the Shadow Tree in the Lands of Shadow. But then the wars of the Erdtree would take place in the Lands Between, and the Lands of Shadow would not be a part of that conquest, and thus the crusade would take place after the final event of these initial Erdtree wars, which indeed is the battle with the fire giants. Secondly, we have to consider the Carian connection when we're placing this in the timeline, and I think R'Lana's involvement suggests that it must have taken place after the two wars of Liurnia and Rennala and Radagon's marriage. It was the two wars of Liurnia and its conclusion that led to the alliance of the Tree and the Moon, and thus it seems unlikely that a Carian princess would ally herself with one of Marika's household before the union of Radagon and Rennala. After all, the item description of R'Lana's helmet suggests that Rennala gave her blessing to her younger sister, an unlikely event in the years prior to her marriage to Radagon, given that Caria and Altus Plateau were at war. It also makes sense that R'Lana would get to know Messmer after Caria became aligned with Leyndell, with the royals of both families likely mixing and coming into contact with one another. And so what I'm going to say next is massively speculative, as are most things in this video to be fair, but going off what we've said then, this must have taken place after the War of the Giants, and after the two wars of Liurnia, when Radagon is married to Rennala. What other event happens around this time? The banishing of the Tarnished and Godfrey. Perhaps this is the instigating event. We know that from the gameplay trailer Messmer is confused by Marika's choosing of a Tarnished for lordship. Surely this means he has prior knowledge of what the Tarnished are. Fire Knight Quilin, the invader who invades us in Bellarat, a servant of Messmer, mocks us for our lack of grace, and promises that we will be burned away in the flame of Messmer. Again, this suggests a hatred for the Tarnished, or at least a understanding of what they are. We know that Messmer and his followers are fanatical in their beliefs about grace and those without it. Perhaps when Marika banished the Tarnished, Messmer thought she was being too soft, and this led to some disputes between the two, and Messmer would come to the Lands of Shadow to create his own realm, a realm that would have those without grace put in their proper place and exterminated as he believes the Tarnished should have been. Again, that's just a guess, and it's my speculative timeline as of now, that this crusade took place after the two wars of Liurnia. Of course, I have like 5% of the picture, and I will be interested to get the rest of the jigsaw pieces in the release of the game. So thanks guys, that is my current analysis of the lore as discovered by myself and other attendees. I'm very excited for what new discoveries lie ahead, as this is just a taste of what is to come. Again, I want to emphasise that a lot of this is just fun speculation, and I wanted this to be a time capsule as of now, before we play the full game and all of this theory crafting becomes irrelevant. But recording this right now is an important moment, as I'll likely not be creating any content until after release, when I release my first Shadow of the Erdtree long-form lore video. And so I just want to thank you all for the support up to now, up to this expansion. It's been an incredible ride the past 2 years, and I'm really excited for what the next few months and years contain for us all with this new information and new expansion. And so I'll see you after release guys, and I just want to wish you a really happy 21st of June when the game comes out and we all get to experience it. So take care guys, and next time I will see you in the Lands of Shadow. Have a wonderful night.